Today is August 21st, 1992, a peaceful, early autumn morning in northern Idaho. The air would soon be filled with screaming, suffering, and the sulfuric smell of gunpowder. It would mark the start of an 11-day siege in one of the most infamous tragedies in law enforcement history. To truly understand the events that unfolded that day, we will need to begin at the start. The very start. Randall "Randy" Weaver was born on January 3, 1948 in Iowa to a small Christian farming family, leading a life typical of those in the American Midwest. In 1968, at the height of the Vietnam War, Randy, now 20 years old, left community college to enlist in the military, seeking to serve his country. He trained as a demolition combat engineer in Fort Bragg, but was never deployed to Vietnam. A common misconception perpetuated by the media, Randy Weaver was not a Green Beret or a decorated war veteran, but he did serve in the military, being honorably discharged in October of 1971. The reason why he left the military is debated, but it was most likely due to disillusionment with the Vietnam War and with the American government itself. A month after being discharged, Randy married Vicki Jordanson, a girl from his hometown. At first, their life was relatively normal. Randy briefly went back to college before deciding to take a job at the John Deere manufacturing facility in Iowa. The Weaver household began to change as Vicki became increasingly religious. Not a bad thing in and of itself, but Vicki became infatuated with Old Testament prophecies and visions of the apocalypse, focusing on fire and brimstone, end of the world type of stuff, instead of the Jesus of the New Testament. Which, personally speaking, the prophecies in the Bible are pretty interesting. But like everything else in the Bible, it's necessary to take it in context with the rest of the scripture, otherwise you can just pick and choose verses to fit your worldview. This focus on preparing for the apocalypse, combined with Randy's distrust of the US government after the Vietnam War, led the couple to decide to isolate their family from the evil and corruption of the outside world. They began to look for a remote property where they could live off the grid, which is also something I could get behind. I mean, who doesn't want to unplug from the hassles of modern life every once in a while? Now, in 1983, the Weavers purchased a 20-acre plot of land in the mountains of northern Idaho, about 30 miles south of the Canadian border. Randy paid $5,000 for the homestead and the moving van, which would be about $16,000 today, adjusted for inflation. Overall, not a bad deal for the peaceful, secluded lifestyle that the Weavers were seeking. The property was on a mountain peak dubbed Caribou Ridge, with Ruby Ridge being the next peak over, but later on the media popularized the name Ruby Ridge, and that's what stuck. The Weavers almost fully withdrew from modern society and had 3 children, which they named Sarah, Samuel, and Rachel. However, life would not be peaceful for long. In 1984, Randy Weaver was involved in a property dispute with his neighbor Terry Kennison over a specific piece of land. Eventually, they took it to court and Randy won, while Terry wound up owing $2,100. In true Karen fashion, Terry decided to write a letter to the FBI, claiming that Randy Weaver was plotting to kill then-President Ronald Reagan, the governor of Idaho, and the Pope, which is insane behavior, but I guess Terry's just a really sore loser. Despite how ridiculous the accusation clearly was, the FBI began looking into Randy. On February 12, 1985, Randy and his wife were brought in for questioning by the local sheriff, 2 Secret Service agents, and 2 FBI agents. It quickly became clear that Randy had no plans to assassinate anyone, let alone the president. He was perfectly happy with his quiet, secluded life, and he didn't harbor any kind of murderous tendencies. However, the FBI saw an opportunity in Randy. During the interrogation, federal agents asked him about his association with Frank Kumnick, a member of the Covenant, the Sword, and the Arm of the Lord, or the CSA, which was a domestic militia group. Nothing substantial came from this line of questioning, and the Weavers were allowed to go back home, but the federal authorities decided to watch them. 1 year later, in July of 1986, Randy Weaver's name was brought up in federal agencies again when an undercover ATF informant reported seeing him at a meeting of the Aryan Nations. The Aryan Nations were a militia group founded on the ideals of white supremacy and had committed a litany of crimes, including trafficking firearms, which fell under the ATF's purview. The ATF informant was Kenneth Fedley, who was a 245-pound biker who was going undercover with the name Gus Magisono. When I was doing research for this story, there's a lot of misinformation about the, some of it malicious, some of it not, about the story overall of Ruby Ridge. But one of the funniest things I think that probably happened was, for a while, the document that I was looking at had Gus Magisono listed as Gus Mino. So I was operating under the impression that he was undercover with the name Gus Mino, which sounds like a middling Sunday cartoon villain. It's McLovin levels of ridiculous. Regardless, he saw Randy Weaver at one of their meetings, so the government officially classified him as a member, claiming that he had participated in their crimes as well, including bank robberies, theft, and the murder of a Jewish talk show host. In reality, Weaver was not a member of the Aryan Nations, something that the media also perpetuated. It was later revealed that he went to 4 meetings over the course of 3 years, and did not go to the meetings themselves, instead just talked to people in the parking lot, offering to do odd jobs for them, and then leaving. Meanwhile, the Weaver family had become rooted in a very specific interpretation of Christianity, one that focused on Old Testament law and prophecy, and really not at all on anything to do with the New Testament or Jesus Christ. It was very much based in like us versus them mentality, marking the outside world as inherently corrupt and dangerous. They put a bunch of signs around their property reading, "Every knee shall bow to Yeshua Messiah." Yeshua is the Hebrew spelling and pronunciation of Jesus, again showing the Weaver's family devotion to Old Testament customs. However, despite their preference for seclusion, Randy was relatively active in the local community. In 1988, he ran for sheriff of Boundary County, pledging to enforce only the laws that people wanted to be enforced, which made him popular. And as a campaign gimmick, he handed out get-out-of-jail-free Monopoly cards, which I just think is kind of cool. Not a good dude, but that's pretty cool. On October 11th, 1989, Randy Weaver invited Kenneth Fadley, the undercover ATF agent posing as Gus Magisono, to visit his property. Weaver, unaware of Fadley's true identity, spoke openly about how he and his family had been preparing for the coming end times. Fadley said he wanted 2 short-barreled shotguns and asked Weaver to make them for him. Weaver, short in cash and needing the money, agreed. Fadley gave him 2 shotguns, pre-marking the barrels so Weaver knew where he wanted them cut. Weaver cut the barrels and reassembled the shotguns, giving them back to Fadley 2 weeks later. Fadley paid him $300 total, promising $150 later. Now, there's nothing illegal about that transaction. Everything there was perfectly, entirely legal. Or so it seemed. It turns out that Fadley marked the barrels just below 18 inches, which is a violation of the ATF's interpretation of the NFA. Now, if you're a normal person and you're wondering what that means, I'll try to explain it as simply and as straightforward as I can. The 1934 NFA, or National Firearms Act, is a U.S. federal law regulating certain firearms and devices, including machine guns, suppressors, and short-barreled rifles and shotguns. Now, none of those things are actually illegal if you file a mountain of paperwork and pay the government a ton of money, but for all intents and purposes, they might as well be. It was created in the 1930s during the Prohibition to try and lessen gang violence, especially with big city mafias who were outgunning on-duty cops. Ironically, charging law-abiding citizens more money for the things that they already own is not that different from what the mafia were doing, charging for protection money, so do with that what you will. Its original intent was to reduce violent crime, which it didn't even work at that, but by the 1980s, the NFA had become a tool for prosecuting minor infractions and just really entrapping people to get them to become federal informants. Now, while it was supposed to be a short-term solution for a panicked populace trying to fight off rampant crime organizations, it just does not make sense being applied to modern technology, especially with the developments in firearm engineering since the 1930s. But it is, however, a very good way for the government to make more money, so I don't see that being repealed anytime soon. Similarly, the ATF was also created to fight organized crime, but was eventually given the power to interpret the NFA, which basically allows them to create whatever laws they want without passing them, as long as they're about guns. They release new rulings whenever they want, outlawing certain kinds of grips or stocks or braces, usually after they've said that it's perfectly okay to own that kind of thing and sold those exact parts themselves for years. But as soon as they pass a new judgment, let's say on a particular type of grip or handle, and they say now it falls under the NFA, then you can't physically have it on your gun anymore. That's a federal crime. But if you just have it off, just laying to the side, just as a separate part, a lump of plastic, then that's fine. Or in some cases, if you have a stock that's detachable, if you take it off your gun, then your gun is considered too small, and it becomes classified as an SBR or short-barreled rifle, and you need to pay them hundreds of dollars and do a mountain of paperwork, or you can pay thousands of dollars and go to federal prison. So it's really just up to you. Plus, if you can bypass these laws by paying them extra money, is it about public safety, or is it just a way to make some more cash? It's overly complicated and messy, but they set it up that way on purpose, so they have lots of gray area to operate. Essentially, they have the power to create laws and then enforce them, which some people say is unconstitutional. Now, it's a lot more complicated than that, and I had to massively generalize that, so the video didn't turn to a long discussion of legal precedents, which I don't think is something any of you want to see, and honestly, I don't blame you. Now, you hopefully have a surface-level understanding of the ATF and the NFA, so that we can return back to Randy Weaver. Now, if you remember, Randy had just cut down these shotguns for the undercover agent, but they had been marked just a little bit too short. In Randy's case, he could be fined $10,000 and given 10 years in prison. Fadley, the undercover agent, begins drafting the charges with the ATF, but another informant, Rico Valentino, warns Randy that Fadley is an ATF agent. Randy confronts Fadley, yelling at him and just kind of showing his general distaste for the government, and Fadley drives away and never speaks to Randy again, never interacts with him, ever again, nothing to do with him. The ATF spent several months preparing the case against Randy, and that's where they began to play it fast and loose with the facts. In the report, they say that Weaver is wanted for several armed robberies, multiple counts of attempted murder, and a number of other crimes associated with Arya Nation, which Randy had absolutely nothing to do with, and that was something that they knew very well, but they put it on the thing anyway, because the more dangerous they made him seem, the more resources they could have to apprehend him. And on June 12th, 1990, the ATF approached Randy Weaver with their offer, and it went about as well as you'd expect, and Randy, disgusted by the offer, said no, and a few other things, and then proceeded to call every contact he had in the region and let them know that the ATF was looking for informants. The ATF, as you could probably guess, was not very happy about this, and they began to formulate a plan. On January 17th, 1991, over a year from the actual incident occurring, a group of ATF agents posed as tourists with a broken-down car at the base of Ruby Ridge, and Randy and Vicky Weaver came down to help them fix the car. As Randy was leaning over to inspect the hood of the car, they arrested them both. Randy said, "Haha, good trick, you won't get me with that one again." Randy Weaver was arrested and charged, but seeing as it was a non-violent crime and he had no prior criminal history, he was released on bail with a court date of February 19th, 1991. Randy met with his probation officer and his lawyer only once. He clearly didn't trust either of them and was kind of done with bureaucrats at this point and told them to send him a letter if they needed to speak with him. Because it was so close to a federal holiday, the court date was moved by one day to February 20th, which I don't know how much of a difference that makes, but whatever. Randy's lawyer sent him a letter to tell him, but he made a mistake, and instead of saying that it had been moved by one day, he said it had been moved by 1 day and 1 month to March 20th. Later realizing his mistake, his lawyer sends him a bunch of letters trying to correct it, but they didn't get to Randy in time, and on February 20th, Randy isn't there for his trial. So Randy's charged with failure to appear in court, which his lawyer asked to be dismissed if Randy shows up on March 20th, but the judge isn't having that and refuses. And so on March 14th, Randy is officially charged and now considered a fugitive from justice. This whole mess was a combination of a number of screw-ups, especially from Randy Weaver's lawyer, which it seems like he made a ton of mistakes. At one point, he told Weaver that if he loses the case, Randy would lose his house and the property, which is entirely false. At this point, Randy has become extremely paranoid and is just refusing to leave his house or his property after he got arrested. This guy that he thought was his friend turns out to be a federal agent, and when he went to help some people with their car, he got arrested. So his faith in the outside world, which was never that high to begin with, is at an all-time low. Meanwhile, his wife Vicky is dealing with something similar. Being fed up with the whole situation, she writes a series of letters to the Idaho U.S. Attorney's Office, but just addresses them to the general U.S. government. These letters are a huge point of contention in the case, so I'm just going to read the most quoted parts. She opens it by addressing it to the, quote, servants of the Queen of Babylon, which is a hell of a way to start it off. We, the Weaver family, have been shown by our Savior and King Yeshua, the Messiah of Saxon Israel, that we are to stay separated on this mountain and not leave. We will obey our lawgiver and king. Whether we live or whether we die, we will not obey your lawless government. The ATF used these letters to make their case that Randy never intended to show up to court and that the Weavers were just crazed and out for blood, instead of it just being the angry letters of a wife with a flair for the dramatic. Honestly, it reads like something like Kanye would post on Facebook. But the next excerpt is the one that they mainly point to as showing violent intent. A long-forgotten wind is starting to blow. Do you hear the approaching thunder? It is that of the awakened Saxon. War is upon the land, and the tyrant's blood will flow. What Vicky Weaver is saying here in her Old Testament-loving, Shakespearean poetry kind of way is that when Jesus comes back, the government will be punished by God for their actions because they're really being mean right now. However, when the federal government read this, they did not seem to be big on theoretical literary devices and poetry, and they treated it as a very serious and credible threat against federal agents, which further exacerbated the whole situation. Meanwhile, to Randy, it's beginning to seem like there's a full conspiracy against him. He's just found out that because he didn't show up on the original date, they want to send him to jail, even though he was told it was moved to March 30th. The local law enforcement gets some of Randy's neighbors to go up and talk to him about it, and they come down with a list of demands from Randy. In exchange for coming down from the mountain, Randy wants his pistol back that they took when they arrested him, he wants the charges for not appearing in court to be dropped, and he wants the judge to apologize to him for calling him paranoid. Now, although the case originally belonged to the ATF, now that Randy is a fugitive from justice, it gets passed to the US Marshals, and as a result, they're now finding out about Randy for the first time, and they're only going off of the information that the ATF gave them, which is still mostly blatantly false because it still says all of the stuff about him being wanted for multiple counts of armed robbery and attempted murder, and at one point they even get his name wrong and start referring to him as Mr. Randall as his last name. So as a result, the US Marshals are under the impression that they're dealing with a highly violent individual who will not hesitate to shoot. So they spent a full year planning out the capture of Randy Weaver, and it wasn't until March 4th, 1992 that they made their first attempt. Two marshals walked up to Weaver's property and told him he had a warrant out for his arrest. Randy, who had a long rifle over his back, told them that they were trespassing on private property and to go away. So they did. In response, the U.S. Marshals began their second attempt, codenamed Operation Northern Exposure. Decked out in camouflage, night vision goggles, and rifles, they snuck onto the Weaver property and planted a litany of video cameras and microphones in and around the Weaver household. Most of the recovered photos and videos of the event are from the footage captured from these cameras. Over the next 4 months, the U.S. Marshals would watch these cameras, occasionally sneaking onto the Weaver property at night, heavily armed and kitted out with night vision to gather more information. It was through this that they discovered the full makeup of the Weaver family, specifically the children. At the time, Sarah was 16, Samuel was 14, Rachel was 10, and they just had a 10-month baby girl named Elisheba. I don't know. Old Testament name. Makes sense for them. They had a lot of animals, and the two older girls would often ride the horses, while Samuel and Randy would play together or do chores, and Vicky took care of baby Elisheba. They had their own well, grew their own crops, and homeschooled their kids. They were almost entirely self-sufficient. Each and every one of these details were meticulously jotted down by the hidden and probably very bored US Marshals. Mainly, they were observing Randy. Randy had become increasingly paranoid, and perhaps for good reason. He went everywhere with a rifle slung over his back, which isn't abnormal when you live in a place with bears. But every time a car came close to the entrance of the property, he would take up a defensive position. His paranoia that he was being watched would later be proven right, as one of the Weavers found one of the hidden cameras on May 5th, 1992. Upon finding the camera, there was an immediate shift in the Weaver household. They suddenly spent most of their time inside the house, and Randy's friend Kevin Harris came to stay with them to protect the family. Kevin was young, in his mid-20s, and he had zero relation to the Aryan Nation or any of those other groups. He was just a family friend who came over to help however he could. In later testimony, it was revealed that the Weavers knew Randy was in some kind of danger, but they figured that if they just stayed up on the mountain and removed themselves from the society that didn't want them, they wouldn't be harmed. And for a while, that seemed to be the case. Unfortunately, all that would change on the morning of August 22nd, 1992. 6 US Marshals, dressed in camouflage and armed with rifles, snuck onto the Weaver property. They split into two teams, one for reconnaissance and the other operating as overwatch. In a bizarre decision, the US Marshals attempted to test the reaction of the Weaver's dog, Striker, by hurling rocks at the house, which was not very stealthy of them. Unsurprisingly, the dog, Striker, noticed them throwing rocks at it and started barking at the agents and then running towards them. The Marshals, realizing that they had just done something very stupid, started to retreat into the woods, but then they turn back and they shoot Striker, killing the dog instantly. Now, I understand nothing is black and white, and that things are difficult from everyone's perspective, so I'm going to try and put myself into the mindset of this federal agent. So it's a dog barking at us, and we don't want to be noticed, so we decide to shoot at the dog and towards the house, which is realistically one of the loudest noises that we can make right now. Remember, we also think that Randy is an armed and dangerous fugitive who is desperately looking for any excuse to start shooting at anyone. I know it's easy to like Monday morning quarterback, but this mistake, this one stupid decision leads directly to everything that will follow. And I mean, without that first shot, it might still have all been peaceful. Randy's 14-year-old boy, Samuel Weaver, and Kevin Harris follow the dog out of the house, thinking maybe Striker was chasing some kind of wild animal. This immediately changes when they hear a gunshot and see two figures rising in the woods in full camouflage. Striker lays in the blood-soaked grass, dead. The boy Samuel yells, "You shot my dog, you son of a bitch," and he raises his rifle and shoots back at the mysterious men in the woods. Remember, from his perspective, two random men just walked out of the woods and shot his dog. They did not identify themselves as federal agents, as US Marshals, or anything of the sort. They just started shooting. US Marshal William Deegan shoots Samuel in the arm, seriously wounding him. Samuel is losing a lot of blood, and he turns around and goes to run back to his house. At this point, William Deegan raises his rifle again and shoots the fleeing child in the back, killing him. Kevin Harris, who's taking cover behind a rock, shoots back at Deegan and kills him instantly. A firefight ensues with Randy and Kevin trading fire with the remaining federal agents before they make their escape back to the house. And this officially starts the 11-day siege. The Weaver family was obviously devastated, especially Vicky Weaver, who was completely inconsolable. Remember, this all escalated very quickly, completely out of nowhere. They literally walked out of the woods, and in an instant, her baby boy is dead. They're trying to process all of this. They move Samuel's body to the nearby shed until they can bury him properly, just trying to get him away from the hungry forest creatures and the elements, and just protect the body. While the Weaver family grieved, the federal agents were rapidly creating a new plan. The team sent to Weaver's house, retreated and called for reinforcements, but left out some key bits of information. They didn't tell him that they shot Weaver's dog, they didn't tell him that they shot Weaver's little boy, and they said that they were fired upon first. Now, all this would be later proven wrong in a court of law, but at the time, when they hand it over to the next agency, that's all the information they have to go off of. And with as any fugitive case, when a federal agent is killed, it gets handed over to the FBI. And when the FBI assumed control, they were debriefed, now given two sets of false information, all the stuff about being wanted for armed robbery and murder and all the stuff from the ATF, and now all the lies about being fired upon first and not shooting Weaver's dog and child from the US Marshals. Now the FBI is under the belief that the Weavers are a heavily armed militant group who might harm their own family or use them as hostages, so they deploy the FBI's Hostage Rescue Team, or HRT team, to Ruby Ridge. The FBI also enacts a new controversial set of rules of engagement, or ROE, which allows them to shoot any armed individual on sight, which, just so you know, that's usually reserved for foreign military conflicts, like when the GRS team was trying to defend the Benghazi embassy from invading Islamic forces, that's the rules of engagement they had. So this was the first time that a official shoot-on-sight order was given during peacetime against US citizens on American soil. On August 22nd, day 2 of the standoff, the Weavers decided to briefly leave the house to go check on Samuel's body. Kevin Harris, Randy, and his oldest daughter, Sarah, walk out of the house and over to the shed. Hidden, unseen in the trees, hostage rescue team sniper Lon Horiuchi had taken up a position overlooking the cabin, and when Randy turned to unlatch the shed door, Lon Horiuchi fired, hitting Randy in the shoulder. Randy, Sarah, and Kevin Harris all retreat back towards the cabin, where Vicky is standing, holding the door open and holding her infant in her arms. Lon Horiuchi sees this and shoots and kills Vicky Weaver, an unarmed woman holding her baby, and wounds Kevin Harris, who had gone inside the cabin. Randy was inside the cabin, watching his wife slowly crumple to the floor, the hole punched through her leak her lifeblood on the floorboards of their family home. Underneath her, her baby began to suffocate, trapped underneath the weight of her dead mother's body. Randy quickly ran over and scooped up his infant daughter, lifting his wife's body off the wailing baby. Randy Weaver was not a good person, but I don't think that should ever happen to anyone, especially over missing a court date. That's insane. Lon Horiuchi never reported that he shot Vicky Weaver, and the FBI didn't find out about it until the siege was nearly over. It was, however, at this point, that the FBI decided to try just talking to them. Maybe they should lead with that next time, but I'm not a trained federal agent, so what do I know? Anyway, at 6:30 p.m., an APC, or Armored Personnel Carrier, pulled up to the Weaver cabin. From within the APC, FBI agents used a megaphone to demand Randy Weaver's surrender, telling him that they had a warrant for his arrest. Well, not a terrible idea necessarily. It was executed terribly. For fear of being shot, the agents pointed the megaphone straight down towards the ground, so no one could hear what they were saying. Understandably, none of the Weavers responded to the garbled mumbling. Having just watched their mother and brother be killed, they stayed inside, crawling along the floor to avoid being shot through the windows. Kevin Harris is still laying on the kitchen floor, Lon Horiuchi's bullet lodged in his gut, fighting off infection and excruciating pain. At one point, he begged Randy to shoot him and end his suffering, something that Randy steadfastly refused to do. At this point, the FBI's attempt to communicate, after days of silence and violence, was too little, too late. On August 23rd, the FBI decided to try another option. They deployed a remote-controlled robot that had a phone attached to it in hopes that they could negotiate with Randy Weaver. However, they looked over one glaring issue. The remote-controlled robot had a large shotgun mounted to it that pointed directly at whoever wanted to use the phone. It was like something out of like a Looney Tunes cartoon, rolling a robot up to the door with a phone, pointing a massive shotgun at you and saying, "Pick up the phone, we just want to talk." Randy was not falling for this and did not mess with the shotgun-wielding robot. The FBI later said that the shotgun was an oversight and a mistake, and that they forgot about it, which is kind of an insane thing to forget about, but that's just me. The FBI, now 0 for 2 in communication attempts, tried the megaphone method again. This time from a further distance, but actually pointing the megaphone at the house and not in the dirt. Now, it's important to remember at this point that the FBI was not aware that Vicky Weaver was dead, as Lon Horiuchi had not told anyone. I want you to imagine for a moment that you're a member of the Weaver family. You are trapped in this cabin with the rest of your family, and gun-toting federal agents are outside your door with armored vehicles. Your dad and his friend are bleeding out all over the floor, and your mom's corpse is rotting next to you and has been for days. In the middle of all of this, you hear some FBI bigwig get on the horn and bellow, "What did Vicky have for breakfast this morning?" I genuinely cannot overstate how absolutely tone-deaf that is. To the FBI, it was just them trying to break the ice. But to the people huddled on the floor of this cabin, it was beyond evil. The Weavers wisely did not respond to this, and that left the FBI at 0 for 3 for attempted negotiation. As someone who has a terrible, evil sense of humor, it's kind of funny in a really screwed up, messed up way, just hearing "Yo, what did your wife have for breakfast this morning?" after you just shot her. Really unfortunate timing. It was at this point, on the night of August the 23rd, that the FBI moved to clear out the surrounding structures near the Weaver cabin, including the shed that Randy had been trying to get into when Lon Horiuchi shot him in the shoulder. When the FBI agents opened it up to find Sammy Weaver's body inside, they were shocked. Remember, until this point, the FBI had been told by the US Marshal Service and by the ATF that the entire family was alive and actively resisting arrest. The very clear entrance wound in Sammy's back also raised a lot of questions about if a bunch of US Marshals just shot a fleeing kid in the back, but that would be explored later. Basically, the FBI started to piece together that they had been lied to. This came together in conjunction with a number of protests that were taking place at the base of Ruby Ridge, with a number of locals and anti-government activists holding up signs and trying to hold the FBI accountable. When the news of Samuel's death reached the crowds, a furious uproar went through the crowd, and the FBI had a whole new problem on their hands. The locals and the general public at large were pissed. On August 26th, the FBI changed the ROE, or the Rules of Engagement, back to the normal non-wartime allowance of lethal force only when lives were in immediate danger, which was long overdue and should never have been changed in the first place. Back at the base of Ruby Ridge, members of the Aryan Nation joined the protesters to denounce the FBI's actions, which really just did not help the Weavers' case. It kind of kills the vibe when you're protesting something and a group of Nazis show up and agree with you. This also helped the media narrative at the time that it was just a shootout between the FBI and a compound full of entrenched white supremacists. Meanwhile, up in their cabin, the Weavers are listening to all this go down on their little radio. Fearing a full-scale assault, Randy grew increasingly convinced that just leaving the cabin meant certain immediate death. Despite this, he tried to make a request to speak to his sister, Martin's Joy, who had traveled to the roadblock. Over the next 2 days, the FBI briefly attempted to reach out with them through the megaphone, but they were way too far away to be heard. The turning point came on August 27th, when Bo Gritz, a former Green Beret and well-known figure within military and survivalist communities, arrived at Ruby Ridge. Gritz's reputation as an advocate for veterans and as a negotiator made him a man that Randy Weaver had a deep respect for. Unlike the previous FBI negotiators, Gritz just walked up to the porch of the Weaver cabin and knocked on the door, choosing to treat Randy like a human being instead of a caged animal. For the first time since the standoff, and probably for a few years, someone just had a genuine conversation with Randy. He explained the full story, something none of the government agencies were privy to at that point. Randy had been shot, Kevin Harris was bleeding out from a gut wound, and his wife and son were dead. A horrified and deeply troubled Gritz returned to the FBI command post to explain the situation to them. When the news broke of Vicky's death, an unarmed woman holding her baby, shot in cold blood, the already volatile crowd that was gathered at the base of Ruby Ridge erupted into outrage, further complicating the situation for the FBI. Over the next few days, Gritz made a series of trips to the cabin, building up trust with Randy. At this point, both Weaver and Kevin Harris were convinced that they would not survive the standoff, and had Randy's oldest daughter, Sarah, write down their testimonies about the events, hoping their side of the story would live on if they were killed. Gritz looked over Kevin Harris, examining the infected wound and the fever that had set in. Gritz convinced him to come on out so he could evacuate him for medical treatment. So it was on August 30th that Gritz walked Kevin Harris to the bottom of the hill, where he was rushed to a hospital, where he would later make a full recovery. Now that Harris was safe, Gritz and a family friend of the Weavers, Jackie Brown, returned to the cabin to move Vicky Weaver's body, which had remained next to them on the floor of the house for 9 days. Vicky's daughters cried and begged the two of them not to let her body touch the ground. On the morning of August 31st, 1992, Bo Gritz made his last trip up to the Weaver cabin. He sat down and explained the full situation to Randy, promising that no harm would come to him or to his daughters. Exhausted, grieving, and trusting Gritz, Randy agreed. And so Randy Weaver, along with his daughters and Gritz, left the cabin and came down the mountain. The 11-day siege was finally over. Randy was arrested and given medical treatment for his gunshot wound, while his daughters were placed in state custody before eventually living with their aunt and uncle. In the aftermath of the siege, both Randy Weaver and Kevin Harris were charged with first-degree murder for the death of US Marshal William Deegan. Federal agencies wanted to convict the family so badly that they originally tried to try a 16-year-old Sarah Weaver as an adult for an accessory to murder, despite her having nothing to do with Deegan's death or even being there at the time. The attempted charge thankfully didn't stick. Randy Weaver's trial began on April 13, 1993. It was a critical moment in determining how the public and the legal system would historically remember the Ruby Ridge standoff. Weaver faced 10 charges, ranging from first-degree murder to conspiracy and resisting arrest. The trial drew a lot of attention, both because of the controversy surrounding the case and the reputation of Randy's new defense attorney, Jerry Spence. Spence, who was known for his charisma and dramatic courtroom style, adopted an unconventional approach. Instead of calling a single defense witness, he focused entirely on just cross-examining government witnesses and exposing the lies in the prosecution's case, which proved to be extremely effective, tearing apart the official narrative with laser precision. Spence focused on the ATF's initial investigation into Randy, arguing that their actions were tantamount to entrapment, when the informant gave him mismarked shotgun barrels. Entrapment laws make it illegal for law enforcement to convince someone to commit a crime that they would not have otherwise committed. Spence also focused on the first-degree murder charge, specifically highlighting the inconsistencies in the agents' testimonies, none of which could seem to agree on one definitive version of events. In June of 1993, the jury delivered its verdict. Randy Weaver was acquitted of all charges except failure to appear in court, the original misdemeanor that had started the whole mess. For that, he was sentenced to 18 months in prison and a $10,000 fine. However, with credit for time served, Randy was released in December of 1993. Kevin Harris, who shot and killed US Marshal Deegan, was also acquitted. The court ruled that he had acted purely in self-defense, and that his actions were justified in the chaotic circumstances of the initial shootout. You'd think that Kevin was off the hook for the situation, but I guess some prosecutor was salty, and 5 years later, tried to try him again for the same crime. But his case was quickly dismissed under double jeopardy, which is a real legal principle that prohibits a person from being tried twice for the same crime. The aftermath of Ruby Ridge resulted in the Department of Justice launching a comprehensive review of the FBI's actions. The resulting Ruby Ridge Task Force produced a 542-page report examining not only Ruby Ridge, but also the FBI's subsequent role in the Waco Siege. The main criticism focused on the controversial rules of engagement and Lon Horiuchi's killing of Vicki Weaver, which violated every law enforcement procedure and constitutional protection. The report also revealed a number of other details about the FBI's behavior before and after the siege. It was revealed that the Marshals had been told not to communicate directly with Randy Weaver and to avoid any attempt at peaceful negotiation, which would have likely solved the situation with no lives lost. Additionally, internal FBI documents that were critical of the agents' actions were hidden during the event, making it harder to hold them accountable. This included a number of doctored crime scene photos and altered communication logs, something that Randy's lawyer, Jerry Spence, highlighted during the trial. The state of Idaho tried to charge Lon Horiuchi with manslaughter for the killing of Vicki Weaver, but the federal government stepped in and had the charges dropped. Within the FBI, there were almost no consequences. Richard Rogers, the commander of the FBI hostage rescue team at Ruby Ridge, was briefly demoted, but he got his old position back as soon as buzz died down. Richard Rogers and Lon Horiuchi were both prominently involved in the FBI's operation in Waco, Texas, which is what I'll be covering in my next video. In August of 1995, the Weaver family filed a civil lawsuit against the federal government, seeking $200 million in damages for the wrongful deaths of Vicki and Samuel Weaver. While the case did not go to trial, the government agreed to settle out of court to avoid public embarrassment. Randy Weaver received $100,000, and his three oldest daughters were awarded $1 million each, bringing the total settlement to $3.1 million. During the lawsuit, Randy Weaver accepted responsibility and said it was partially his fault, with some of his actions leading to the escalation of events, but he remained steadfast that no American should fear the government killing their family members over a misdemeanor. In the years following the settlement, Randy Weaver published a book, The Federal Siege at Ruby Ridge, in our own words, offering his perspective on the events. His daughter Sarah also wrote a book, and became a vocal advocate for peace and forgiveness, later saying that she forgave the federal agents at Ruby Ridge and embraced the loving Christian worldview instead of a hateful one. Randy Weaver took a different path. Deeply traumatized by the deaths of his wife and his son, he became increasingly bitter and withdrawn. He frequently attended anti-government protests and military gatherings, and in 2007, during a tax protest, Randy announced that he wanted to die, and that he no longer believed in God, a different man than the one that had walked up that mountain with his family all those years ago. It seems like Randy never found peace, as he passed away in 2022 at the age of 74. The story of Ruby Ridge is a sad one, but it's an important one to remember, not only for the evil that was committed, but so we can learn from the mistakes of the past and ensure that nothing like this ever happens again. To hold the government to their actions and to hold them to a higher standard. Randy Weaver's personal ideologies or choice in friends ultimately doesn't matter. What matters is how spectacularly our institutions failed the very people that they swore to protect. They have to be held to that higher standard, even if it may seem unfair sometimes. And by looking closely at what went wrong and at what hubris or political aspirations led to this deadly chain of events, we can make sure that our federal agents are never given the opportunity to do this again. Only by focusing on these uncomfortable truths can we hope to build a better government that truly serves and protects all of its people. If you got this far in the video, thank you for watching. I really appreciate it. This video took forever to make. A lot of research went into this, a lot of retyping. The script went over like 20 different drafts. So I appreciate you watching this and supporting the channel, doing all the silly YouTube stuff, like button, subscribe, whatever, all that stuff, all the cringy stuff. I appreciate you doing that. It helps. I'm going to be trying to do more content like this in the future. I get big shout out to Wendigoon. His video on this is amazing. Up next is the story of the Waco settlement, so we'll be getting into that. I've been working on the script of that at the same time I was writing the Ruby Ridge one, because they do kind of go hand in hand for many reasons, but I'll talk about that in the other video. I'm going to try and do more videos like this in the future. Let me know if you like them. Feedback is always welcome in the comments. Just let me know. And yeah, thank you very much. Stay safe, stay strapped, and I will see you in the next one.